I took a hike with my son and some of our friends, and we were up in the high peaks of the Adirondacks. And as we hiked, we were kind of bored, as hikes are wont to be sometimes. And so we started sort of making up stories about the landscape around us, looking at sort of an exposed rocky ridge and thinking that maybe that was the sort of spine of an ancient dragon, right? This is entertaining kids' time. A lake was the footprint of some massive shambling giant. A pile of boulders, we decided was the ancient calcified poop of a man-eating rabbit. You know, there was kids. And so as we hiked along, we literally imagined ourselves through the landscape. The most dynamic shift in the history of our species is that from a bipedal, outdoor-dwelling primate to an animal trapped indoors. For instance, now would be a good time to think about this. Scan your own body. How do you feel at this exact moment? Check in with yourself, sitting in this room under fluorescent lights, and ask yourself, how is your body feeling? How do your legs feel? Is your knee bouncing? Probably. Are your thoughts sort of muzzy and hazy? Check in with yourself and figure out where you are. In fact, while you're checking in with yourself, let's just get real about it, okay? They're tough, aren't they? They're kind of brutal. And the reason they're brutal is that we are captive to them. Your eyes are looking at the screen, they're burning, and you feel, for whatever reason, like you really can't think straight. I don't know if this happens to you, it certainly happens to me. So, as you explore your body, I'd like to give you permission to do something right now. Rather than just sitting passive listening to me, I'd like you to feel your butt. Some people went right for it, just to be really clear. Some of you were embarrassed, and some people in the back row, I won't say names, but they're like, hallelujah, I'm all about it. So thank you for those of you brave enough to do that. But seriously, feel your butt and be grateful for it. You know, the butt, as a part of our body, causes a lot of dismay. Some of us feel like it's too big, too little, maybe too stringy, or whatever. But it's time to give the butt its due, right? The gluteus maximus is there for a reason. In order to understand the glory of your butt and why it's so important, those of you that are still feeling your butt, we're kind of done with that part. There's a few in the back that are still sort of in that moment. I mean, I guess whatever you need to do. It's been a long week already. So, the glory of the butt, in order to understand it, in order to understand why the gluteus maximus is even in this talk, we need to think about some of our evolutionary cousins, the chimpanzees, who have very scrawny little butts. Why? Well, because they don't walk like we do. They're not bipedal, right? They're knuckle walkers or climbers. So they move very differently than us. So our butts co-evolved as we became bipedal, as we became upright. This is important, because as we became upright, we became able to explore the landscape in a way that no other species really can do. We have this amazing morphology that allows us to explore the outdoor world. Our bodies have long legs, butts that hold our trunks upright. We have eyes that can see far away on the horizon, but also eyes that are good enough that I can pick things up off the ground and examine them closely and intently. So our entire physiology helps us explore the landscape, move around from place to place. It's so crucial that, in fact, many people that have studied this believe that the evolution of our brains, right, the big cauliflower thing in our heads, sort of was co-evolving at the same time as many of our other morphological traits, our bodies. So what this means is that our ability to sort of explore the world comes from the ability to stand and walk. So it's so important that I think it's time to rename our species. And I'm just going to throw this out there as an idea. Maybe we'll start a meme or something. I think we should no longer be Homo sapiens, which means wise man in Latin. I think we should be Homo gluteans, which means butt man. You heard it here first, okay? Just so we're clear, when that is in the textbooks in a few years, this is where it came from. So, while we're all walking around being butt men, we can talk about how this has anything to do with learning. So, I'll stand aside so you can read all of it. Okay. So, how does it affect our brains specifically that we are large, mobile creatures who walk around upright? In order to walk around the room, or in order to walk around the world as we're evolving and not run into things, and also remember things, we have to have something called spatial learning. This is a skill that we developed neurologically around the same time that we became bipedal, around the time we began walking around. What does that mean? Well, it means that I remember where things are, right? I remember their significance. I remember that that tree over there is near the freshwater spring. I remember that those rocks over there, where my brother Thag got eaten by hyenas. Whatever it is, I begin to identify spaces in the landscape and give them importance. This also increases the size of a part of our brain called the hippocampus, which sort of sits underneath the cauliflower, right? It's this little piece. And it grows throughout our evolutionary history during this time because we begin having to identify the importance of all these different landscape features and what they mean, remembering things, and then also, and this is the important part, determining what significance they're going to have later on. So this is really key, right? This is the basic rubric for intellectual thought. Anticipating events based on past events, being able to draw those conclusions. This comes about simply because we're moving through the open landscape. So, if it's true that spatial learning underlies the basic cognitive processes that we now use to figure out like how to find the mall, right? If those basic structures, neurologically, were built during this time, so the very blueprint of learning happened out in the outdoor world, why now do we sit indoors, sort of like you're doing now, stationary, and try to learn that way, when it's actually at odds with not just our evolutionary history, but our very morphology? So, let's think about how long you sat there right now. You're feeling it, right? Your body, probably, just judging from some of your faces, is feeling a little tired, a little bored. How many hours of your life have you learned like this? So if you were in school for 12 years, not counting kindergarten, and school is about 180 days long, right? You've basically been sitting around for 15,000 hours since, we don't count kindergarten because they'll come go out and play all the time, right? So about 15,000 hours. That's over 600 full days, full 24-hour days. That's over a year and a half. Literally almost a year and a half that you have been sitting trying to learn just like you are now. With your butt in a chair, the magnificent butt, which deserves all the praise we can give it, just passively receiving information. This is at odds with how we're supposed to learn, right? So here's the next phase that we work through as we look at sort of the development of our ability to learn and its relation to the body. The second thing that comes after is something called working memory. And working memory is essentially cognition as we know it, right? The way that you are able to look at past events, predict future ones, and then use that understanding to guide your own actions. Working memory is the most fundamental part of cognition, and it's something that comes within this very clear trajectory of abilities that are all rooted in our ability to move around the outdoor world. So, once we start putting all this together, we begin to see that in reality, given our evolutionary history, learning as something that we've all experienced began in the outdoors, and it began with movement. So, in order to understand how working memory leads to intellectual thought, we need to think about how important it is that we now no longer enact the very behavior that gave us the ability to be cognitive in the way that we are. So, here's where things kind of come to a head, because all of these things lead to the idea of abstract thinking. Symbolism, right? When I see the tree that's near the spring, I don't see the spring itself. That tree then becomes a symbol for me satisfying my thirst, yes? In an evolutionary landscape. That very symbolism is the beginning of the idea of story, of narrative. And really, it's the beginning of this thing that we kind of loosely call imagination, right? Where I make stuff up, where I create entire worlds that don't exist, where I'm able to apply a narrative to events that actually have no linear narrative within them. Disparate, confusing things, I can now begin to assign meaning to the things in my life. This is the beginning of intellectual imagination. So, here's the thing, is that since Descartes' time, 400 years ago, we've had this division of mind and body, right? And this is a very old idea, and one that is still extant in the way that we teach our students, whether it's students in 3rd grade or even yourselves. The way that we teach them is we assume that in order for them to learn, they need to quiet their body. They need to actually sort of think that they don't have a body. And here's another thing that sort of follows along with this line of thinking. When you go outside, what people have found, what researchers have found, is that it actually begins to mitigate some of the very things that keep you from learning. Anxiety, depression, even ADHD has been shown to be effectively treated simply by people going outside into unstructured, natural environments. Which begs the question, why then, if we want people to learn, do we stick them in a room underneath fluorescent lights and not allow them access to those very environments that are conducive to learning? And it sort of makes you wonder one other thing. If all of those conditions are, at least to a certain degree, benefit from being outside, then is it possible that our actual natural state, our actual sort of core of our being from an evolutionary timescale, is one of curious learning? Because when we're out there, that's what we do automatically. You watch any kid playing around in the woods, and eventually, after they complain about being bored a lot, they begin picking stuff up. They begin making stuff up. They begin to play. They begin to just do things, because that's what the environment is conducive to, right? So, the United States is 4th in the world in terms of how much time students spend indoors in school. 4th. It's a lot of time. On top of that now, you know this is coming. People between the ages of 3rd grade and your age, they spend between 6 and 11 hours a day engaged with digital technology. It's phones, laptops, whatever. So put those two together. We spend more time indoors in school than almost everybody else in the world, and we're almost always engaged with digital technology. So we've taken the very act of learning and experiencing the world in a way that helps us understand our own cognitive processes, kind of encourages our imagination, and replaced it with stationary, virtual experiences. So what are the effects of that? Are they connected with those very things that are even more keeping us from the ability to learn, like ADHD and all those sorts of things? Researchers think yes, that it's very possible that they do. So here's the thing, is that as we start thinking about school and learning, and we start asking the basic question, how can we do it better? How can we increase innovation? How can we increase creativity? How can we engage our students more? We have to start thinking about the imagination. That process that sits at the end of that continuum of spatial learning and working memory and those higher level cognitive abilities sort of ends with this idea of imagination. Imagination includes things like what we call imaginative projection. I can put myself into the experience of someone else and kind of try to understand how they feel, how they see the world. These are essential qualities. They're attached to important things like empathy and compassion. These are not just cognitive abilities, they also are intricately tied to many of the traits and behaviors and even emotional states. So we're inside though all the time. And that's why we have a hard time sort of accessing those different modes of learning. You know, the Australian Aborigines have something called the dreaming. And the dreaming is a way for them to describe sort of topography of both the actual land that they live on, but also sort of legends and stories that give them their understanding of themselves, their people, and the way that they live their lives. And what they call them is song lines. And song lines are literally tracks through the bush in Australia, but they're also these metaphoric songs that give them meaning to their lives as they begin to progress and grow and change. And so the very birth of imagination and metaphoric importance, symbolism, and the ability to create meaning for our lives began in that walking around outside, right? In moving through the trackless wilderness and identifying importance to that activity. That's where it comes from. So, right now, we're living in a world that's very different from the world that we evolved in. We're living in a world that is increasingly unfriendly to children. We have auto-centric urban planning. That's changing a little bit, but certainly not fast enough. We have a digital infrastructure that is replacing actual experience with virtual ones. We have a world that is risk-averse. We've started being afraid to allow kids outside to take those risks that help them learn, to actually have those very experiences that increase that kind of imaginative capacity. So, as we start thinking about how to learn and how to change our educational process to encourage learning, we need to start thinking about the relationship between the imagination and the outdoors. Because the reality is, if you can just sit for a second and imagine fantastical worlds, the best thing to do is to go out into the real world and explore it. Thanks for your time.